Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is NAFSIKA KRONIDOU, and I'm a regulatory franchise head at Roche. And one of my passions is to explore how we can use novel technologies to improve global healthcare. As I mentioned, the next slide, as I mentioned, I have one disclaimer, I'm a Roche employee. For today's meeting, I'd have the pleasure of sharing some personal reflections based on the September 2021 CDDF workshop on digital health technologies and AI. In particular, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the topics covered at the September workshop, and then highlight some of what I believe are remaining gaps in supporting the patient needs and building a more coordinated ecosystem. I'll finish with some reflections on how we can address those gaps, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on those ideas at the panel discussion. The next slide, you see an overview of the September 2021 agenda. At the workshop, we had the pleasure of listening to multiple insightful presentations from different experts, institutions, and countries. On my presentation today, I'll touch on some of those insights from the workshop, but will unfortunately not have time to discuss all those elements, and I encourage all of you to have a look at the actual material from that workshop, including slides and the final report. At the workshop, we talked about both opportunities and challenges related to digital health technologies. For example, the opportunity to partner with patients and patient advocacy groups in designing studies in order to generate clinically meaningful data for patients and the study outcome. We also talked about how digital health tools can enable the collection of objective longitudinal data, which we sometimes are not able to collect in a traditional clinical trial, for example, to monitor the disease symptoms or collect side effects using these applications. We also talked about supporting the better diagnosis of patients. For example, how to use digital images of a pathology slide to get more granular information on the tumor, and through the use of software and algorithms, analyze a large volume of information and generate insights to support treatment decisions, which are often referred to as clinical decision support systems. Now, opportunities often come with challenges, and at the workshop, we talked about the challenges related to ethical aspects of AI and how to humanize the experience. We also talked about building a regulatory environment and guidances which can keep up with the fast pace of digital innovation. I will be analyzing and talking through some of those topics in more detail in subsequent sections of my presentation. The next slide, I'd like to acknowledge and thank all the speakers from the September meeting for all the thoughtful and presentations and the lively discussions that we had at the panel discussions. Some of those discussions helped me crystallize my thoughts, and I will be referring to today. On this slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about how digital health technologies can be employed through the life cycle of a product. I think most of you are probably equally excited about the potential of new digital health technologies to improve clinical outcomes for patients while accelerating the development of new treatments for cancer patients. Such tools can be used throughout the life cycle of a molecule, for example, during research and development and following approval of a drug in clinical practice. Before I proceed, I should probably explain what I mean by digital health technologies. While there might not be a globally accepted definitions for today's presentation, I'll be referring to digital health tools as a group of tools such as software, computer platforms, algorithms, sensors, which are being used for healthcare purposes. These technologies can span a range of products, which can either be used to capture or help interpret data in the preclinical research in a clinical study or in clinical practice and be used to develop drugs and monitor a disease. At the workshop in September, and for today's discussion, I'll focus on tools which can be used in clinical studies, such as tools to capture clinical data consistent with the objective of the study. It's important, however, to acknowledge that we cannot see these three stages of the life cycle of a product as independent and separate entities, but that there's a learning loop across them. For example, if the digital tool is used outside of a traditional clinical study, it can generate real-world data that can be used to further improve the technology and/or design future studies. Now, in the next slide, let's look at the overall patient journey. In this new era, where a drug is being combined with a new technology, there are multiple new elements that we all, patients, physicians, industry, and regulators, to name a few of the stakeholders, need to consider. Let's start with the patient. They are now being confronted with multiple questions and choices. For example, how can I get the most accurate diagnosis for my disease? What's the right treatment for me? And how will my disease be monitored? Can I trust the technology if such a technology is being introduced in a clinical study? Study sponsors, therefore, now need to consider additional elements when designing clinical trials, which includes such a technology. Examples of this technology-specific considerations include ethical components, data privacy, data quality, data interoperability, validation of the technology, etc., etc. And we'll need to all consider all those up front before we start those studies. Clearly, all these elements and the related complexity need to operate in an ecosystem, and our ability to execute on the promise of digital health tools to improve healthcare relies to a large extent on building a coordinated ecosystem which enables collaboration and alignment between the different stakeholders. This is the key theme I'd like to expand on during my presentation today by taking a deeper dive on some of those considerations and finally ending with some thoughts on how we could build a more coordinated ecosystem. On the next slide, I'm starting with the patient. I'd like to start with the patient needs because that is what is the center of our work. I'd like to start also with a provocative statement. Do we really know and understand what a patient needs to manage their disease? Or are we making some assumptions based on perhaps our personal experience in another disease or having talked to a single patient who shared some of their thoughts? Here on the left, I share some examples of what a patient may need. For example, a patient may need support to better understand their disease or propose treatment. They may also want access to their own reports and data. Now, are these questions accurate assumptions? I would like to advocate that in the future, we need to involve the patients from the very beginning in designing studies and related tools so that the data which is being collected is valuable to them and to the objective of the study. And in order to do that, we need to build a trustful relationship with patients and by extension society overall, where we truly listen to patient needs and try to address them. In addition, these tools should be designed so that they are user-friendly and not add burden to their already busy lives. On the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about key considerations related to data and artificial intelligence. Despite multiple global initiatives, there are still some open questions that we all need to consider. And then there's an overarching bigger question on whether we need global convergence in addressing some of these questions. So let's start with data. If we all agree that data is high quality data is important to generate insights and informed decisions, then we need to think and consider what are key components in generating high quality data. So, for example, the reliability, the consistency, the ability to link data across the systems is incredibly important. And then, of course, there is the questions of data privacy and security. How can we ensure that the data will be secure and there's no unauthorized access to personal information? Shifting to the right of the slide and related to AI, there are multiple open questions, some of them with ethical perspectives, such, for example, how are we going to maintain human autonomy so that patients feel that they are in control of their own healthcare decisions, and that while we are using artificial intelligence, human logic and intelligence is part of that decision. And how can we make sure that the use of these technologies, including AI, does not increase health disparity because some individuals in some society may not have access or can use these novel technologies? On the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about some additional elements that we need to think about when implementing these digital technologies within our clinical studies. And these relate to feasibility, operational and compliance, technologies and regulatories. And for example, can we easily implement a new technology within our clinical study, and can it be sustainably included? What are the technical regulatory requirements that we need to think about, for example, on the technical and clinical validation of these technologies? And do we need more convergence between international regulators on some of those topics, guidelines, legislations, etc.? On the next slide, and of course, multiple stakeholders are involved in this assessment, and they all have different needs and expertise. We had already talked about the patients. There are, of course, regulatory agencies and governments which are involved, pharmaceutical industries, medical devices and technology industry, health technologies, healthcare professionals and academic centers, and all have different expertise and needs, and we all need to operate and partner together in finding solutions to some of the questions that are raised above. The next slide. I'd like to shift gears and talk a little bit about the need for an ecosystem which learns and is fit for future. And I'd like to use the COVID-19 experience to illustrate how we, in that particular situation, we were able to, because of the urgency of the situation, we were able to adapt the way we were working and introduce more flexibility to meet the patient's needs. And the question I'm posing is, could we be using some of the learnings from the pandemic to build a future ecosystem for digital health technologies, which is more fit for purpose? There are multiple examples here that I'm citing. The ones which are perhaps most relevant for digital health technologies are the use of, for example, telemedicines, which was used during the pandemic to maintain contacts with the patients and captured safety and efficacy data. And this has also led to increased interest on the concept of decentralized studies, which enable patients to participate in clinical studies from home. And finally, I'd like to touch on the last point on the acceptability of new vaccines and the hesitancy in society perhaps because of some lack of trust. And I'm using that last example, not because it's directly linked to new technologies, but how that experience that experience and lack of trust is something that we may need to think about as well when we are introducing more digital health technologies in drug development. On the next slide, I would now like to finally finish with some reflections and proposal on how we could generate a more coordinated healthcare ecosystem to address some of these gaps that I mentioned above. I'm hoping that these reflections can help initiate the dialogue with all of you at the panel discussion, and I'll be looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Let's start with the first topic of building a flexible learning environment. And I've used the pandemic as a good example, which allowed a system to continuously learn and innovate and unblock opportunities to support patients. And what I would advocate that is one possible solution to building that more flexible learning environment is that we actually we build an expertise-based setup and a culture of mutual trust in the scientific work. In other words, that we rely on the experts to drive the generation of new methods or approaches because they are the experts. I talked also through the experience of the pandemic. I also talked about the need to build trust in society and patients, and this early dialogue with patients to understand their needs and concerns is going to be really important. And this understanding of their concerns could also help us design future studies with, for example, more inclusive participation in clinical trials through the use of digital health tools and equitable access to innovation. These technologies could also enhance awareness, could reduce fragmentation through strategic partnership, and I would advocate for more awareness of ongoing activities. In preparation for this presentation, when I was trying to map who is involved in all of these various, the development of guidelines, the development, all the initiatives related to these digital health technologies, there was a very large number. It was almost impossible to map them. And then, therefore, I think we could, for example, think of an across-discipline oversight body which consolidates all these global efforts so that we are first aware and therefore avoid duplication of efforts. I would also advocate that we probably need to consider more frequent publications of some of these important advancements in technology and methods, and aim for more consolidation of opinions instead of all of us publishing. Perhaps we could co-author or commenting on white papers in those publications. I would also like to propose that there is more open and early dialogue and flexible interactions with regulators with more dynamic processes. For example, regulators could sponsor pilots and collaborate in identifying solutions with the various stakeholders that I mentioned, and we could have more open dialogue with scientific committees and experts groups. And finally, I would advocate more flexible regulatory systems that enable global regulatory convergence while supporting timely derivative of safe and effective innovative solutions, similar to what we've seen during the pandemic, where governments, industry, and regulators came together to partner. And finally, I'll close with some closing remarks. I think we're all I hope that you all remain equally excited about the use of digital health technologies and opportunities to further support the patient journey. But successful implementation will require a more coordinated healthcare system, and the CDDF plays an important role in enhancing this awareness of ongoing efforts and therefore reducing fragmentation. And I hope we will all have a chance to, following this pandemic, see each other on face-to-face meetings at future CDDF presentations. Thank you for your attention.